All right, second time lucky. Well, we actually are going to make it through this time around. President Cyril Ramaphosa, among the dozens of world leaders who will present their progress and ambitions report across all pillars of the 2015 Paris Agreement at the UN Climate Summit in Dubai. And that's where we find Newzroom Afrika's Ziyanda Ngcobo, who is at the Expo City in Dubai. And she doesn't look sweaty at all. You're looking very cool, Mapoloba. Good morning to you. Let's talk about that historic moment yesterday, particularly for the developing countries like South Africa. Remind us what it is that has been agreed upon.
Yeah, Toli, I mean, it's very rare that on the first day of the Conference of Parties to get such big news. Of course, the breaking news being that there were pledges made towards that loss and damage fund that was initially negotiated at Cop28 in Egypt, but finally ratified, and actually real pledges being made from countries like the UK, Germany and the UAE. Now, of course, we know that yesterday was when Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber assumed his tenure as Cop28 president, and he held a briefing late in the evening to talk about the historic moment, having tied down these funds, almost close to $1 billion worth of money towards this fund. It's meant to assist developing countries like South Africa, but in particular the African continent, when it comes to the ramifications of climate change. So when you have a natural disaster like we did with the floods in KwaZulu-Natal and in the Eastern Cape, that fund is meant to plow into countries such as ours to be able to assist with relief efforts and infrastructure development. So let's listen to what Cop28 President Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, who I must say has come under fire, Koli, because from NGOs, because he is actually also the CEO of an oil company, and lots to be said about the conflict of interest with him being the Cop28 president. So really taking the moment late last night to be triumphant in having pledged and signed that deal. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We believe all parties left there sufficiently happy. There was the discussions were challenging. This is 30 years worth of discussion, which concluded in Sharm el-Sheikh last year with that historic decision to establish the fund and funding arrangements. But the challenge was how, within a one-year period, with just 5 meetings of the committee, to actually work out the details and iron out the details of how to operationalize it, and not just operationalizing it, but also to start that seed capital for it.
So, Koli, that's Cop28 President Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber speaking there yesterday, very happy, talking about momentum picking up. And you'll recall that I've also been talking about urgency. Of course, we briefly breached the 2 degrees Celsius limitation in November. That's according to a CNN report. So momentum does need to pick up. And so the success of that loss and damage fund really being hailed as kicking off this summit in the correct way. I must say, Koli, let me just reflect on the numbers here. So you have Germany, which committed $100 million, the UK, which committed £40 million, Germany and the UAE $100 million, the US committing $17.5 million. So questions being asked at that media briefing whether there's much to be read into the fact that the US has contributed the least. China and India, for an example, aren't listed as one of the countries that have pledged. This is important because these are some of the nations that are actually said to be one of the biggest wrongdoers when it comes to carbon emissions and the biggest contributors, and this is the point of this wealth fund. But the UN Executive Director General, Simon Steele, reflecting on the fact that there's still time over the next 2 weeks for other countries to pitch in, especially since now that high-level segment with global leaders is currently underway. Let's listen to what Mr. Steele had to say yesterday.
What is significant for me, and it should be for all of us in this room, is the unprecedented nature of the response from some donor countries. Not just the adoption of the recommendations coming out of the committee, which bring the fund and the funding arrangement to life, but the fact that within moments of gavelling, parties, donors willing to put close to $500 million into that fund. Pledging will continue over the course of the next 2 days with the Leaders' Summit. I believe some countries would prefer to make those statements on the grander stage of the Leaders' Summit. But the formal process of how the fund will be capitalized in a sustainable way moving forward. These are decisions that will be made by the board that can now be established now that this decision has been adopted.
All right, Ziyanda Ngcobo, let's then perhaps chart the way forward today. We mentioned at the start of the conversation that President Ramaphosa will be among world leaders there today, having touched down a few hours ago. Anything up his sleeve as to what he will likely say, as he is part of Team South Africa?
Well, Toli, we know that, the main thing going forward for the next 2 weeks, but in particular for the next 2 days in that high-level segment for the World Climate Action Summit with world leaders is going to be the issue around global stock take. That's GST, as it's colloquially known in this part of the world. And that's basically going to be each leader outlining how their country has fared when it comes to the 2015 Paris Agreement. So it has to do with carbon emissions. It has to do with where you are in terms of your green energy. It has to do with green energy technology, for an example. And we already know that South Africa is missing its 2030 targets because of the fact that we've got this issue of load shedding, our just energy transition plan. We are not on track with it, but we're expecting to hear that. And of course, geopolitical tensions never miss in such a fora. Talk, of course, expecting to also hear about how wealthier nations can do more towards actually dealing with climate change. So this is why that loss and damage fund is such an important moment for this conference. Later on, the President will also, at 3 o'clock our time, be visiting the South African Pavilion here, where you'll know that the National Business Initiative has come together under the umbrella where that's brought together, industries from coal mining right through to plastic recycling entities, and they'll be welcoming the President to show him around what they've done, and of course then perhaps we'll get a tete-a-tete with President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Ziyanda Ngcobo, and as she concludes there, did you hear that language, tete-a-tete? She is part of that summit, and live for us, we are going to catch up with her a little later.